All right. Welcome everybody to episode 2 of ASLA Virginia Presents Watershed Moments, where landscape architects, allied design professions, contractors, and developers will gather to talk about the very complicated world that we operate in. Now, an all too common problem that plagues our profession revolves around breakdowns in communication. And it's also a huge topic that impacts our own internal teams, our collaboration with others, our clients, and especially our allied trades. While we could talk endlessly about these different scenarios from where communication is broken down, we might begin to go over the topic in some more broad ways. So instead, we're going to define maybe 3 general areas where this falls under, and then connect this back with our last session on episode 1, where Stephen Talley joined us, and discuss how that might interact with your accountability and ownership. I'm joined today by Jessi Barnes, and she is a landscape architect and a project manager at 3 North, basically a design firm here in Richmond, Virginia. It's filled with landscape architects, interior designers. And I've had the pleasure of working with her at our ASLA Virginia Emerging Professionals Committee, where she co-leads an outreach and mentorship efforts for younger students and young professionals. And welcome, Jessi. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Excited?
Just thrilled. So thrilled.
So happy. So happy to be here. But no, I do appreciate you being here. I'm curious, like as we start out, I asked Stephen this, and this might be a reoccurring question over the next 12 episodes, but what is your impression so far of this leadership and communications program, and kind of how'd you get into it? What'd you think about going into it?
Well, going into it, I really had no idea what to expect. The last time I went through leadership training was in high school, and I'm sure that was like really different than what we're doing now. So I really didn't know what to expect, and we're 2 sessions in now, and it's really causing me to do some self-reflection about, well, like I was telling you earlier, just feeling like I'm better able to identify the gaps in my communication process.
You're not alone. Like there's plenty big gaps with everyone, which is why you would take something like this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so far, I'm really enjoying it. I mean, it's only, like I said, 2 sessions in, they could teach us anything in the next 10 weeks. But like this past week, talking about breakdowns in communication, it just has me really thoughtful and self-reflective. What'd you think about it?
That was good. I really do like hearing because everyone in the group seems to have different backgrounds. Everyone's got stuff with either municipalities, or some of them are consultants like myself. Maybe they're entrepreneurial, or they're working for mixed use firms. There's so many different ways that it kind of takes it on, but hearing their stories about their experiences with breakdowns in communication, or whatever the topic of the day is, that to me is really interesting, because you can garner a lot of different lessons from all of that, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just such a big topic.
That's what I was saying that at first. I was like, this topic is very big because it covers so many different areas of our lives, because projects that we're working on are so complicated. I mean, they really are. Like when you think about putting a building and landscape and civil and all this stuff together, and then having to make drawing sets and then provide those to a contractor who's going to then build the thing with all his subs. Yeah, that's a tall order.
I mean, if you frame it that way and you're talking about I feel like the communication we talk about in this course is very much about verbal communication, either like talking to each other or email or however else you would have verbal communication, like Zoom.
Yeah.
But like as designers, we're also very concerned with graphic communication and making sure that our construction documents are legible and communicate how we want something to be built. So I don't know, it's just, you got me thinking.
Well, do you think there's less of a focus on the actual verbal written presentation of our material in the profession these days, and more of a focus on those graphical elements where people can instantly read something with their eyes and try and make an assumption about what they're presenting or seeing?
I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that. My initial thoughts are like going through school and going through like, you know, your internship, apprenticeship days before you get licensed. Like so much was graphic communication and so little was like like we did some presentation work when I was in college. And of course, you know, as a young designer, you don't present so much because the bosses are usually taking care of that with the clients and all of that. So I feel like, you know, the beginning part of your career, it's very heavily graphic. And then there's this transition point when you get to be, you know, project manager or senior landscape architect, and you're in charge of the verbal communication. And then maybe you're not so prepared for it because nobody's been teaching you.
Like, do you feel like that you are included in those meetings? Like when you were looking back, reflecting on your younger days, when you were maybe at that point of being the production unit in the firm, producing all these graphics, were you included in those meetings? It sounded like you weren't, based on your experience.
Well, I was. I always worked for really thoughtful managers and bosses who did make a point of making sure that the younger staff were at meetings. And of course, we were preparing all the documents for the meetings too. But like, you're there to observe. At least in my experience, I presented a handful of times, and I remember every single time because it was so rare.
Okay.
I don't know, like what, like, do you have a similar experience or was yours different?
No, it's not that different. I really don't think. I felt though that I was being included at a meeting more, but not expected to talk. Like it was weird. Like I had obviously different jobs in the past, but felt like a lot of times if you were speaking, it was like, what are you talking? Why are you saying anything? It was almost like damage control. Like they're afraid you're going to say something that would derail the meeting or completely throw off the whole presentation of what the idea and what they're trying to get across to the client, which that doesn't fill you with confidence either.
No, and I get it though. Like as a young, like if a client's asking you, you know, how much is something going to cost, as a young designer, like I don't know the answer.
Yeah,
you know,
and I wouldn't be like, yeah, it's going to be 60,000.
You would hope not.
You would hope not.
But maybe if you're like the one in charge in that scenario, maybe you're worried that something like that will come out of the young person's mouth. I don't know. I haven't had a lot of experience in managing very young designers. So I don't know what the expectations are or aren't.
Or even like not even presentation as much too, but I felt this in a lot of the team meetings in places I'd worked where your value of opinion was not taken seriously because of your age or experience level.
I don't think I ever felt that way.
That's good.
I've always had pretty good bosses. I've always felt listened to, just not necessarily in a public context.
Yeah.
Like I'll voice my opinions in the studio, not at the client meeting.
But you're not wrong though on this big focus on visual graphics as being such a, I hate to call it a crutch, but it kind of is a crutch. And maybe less focus on the actual verbal or written communication. And the visual graphics to me often are flat images. They're not evolving past that. And we're seeing that some with the rendering programs that are out now, where you have walkthroughs or fly-through animations, but I don't see it enough where they integrate that with pause moments where you might rest for a minute on one scene and say, here's some components of this, here's what we're thinking about, and having that be supportive of a presentation, like an actual presentation, like talking.
Yeah, I feel like thinking about people that I've worked with and like admire, the ones that really stand out to me are the ones who do exactly what you're describing. Like when they do a presentation, they are taking those times to pause. They're taking those times to engage with the client or the consultants. And those are the people that I definitely admire communication wise, that I don't personally don't feel like I'm there.
Yeah.
I feel like I have some ways to go to get to that level.
Yeah, I think even senior level principals and associates oftentimes might even have an overconfidence of what their communication ability is.
Honestly, I feel like that's me. Like
Yeah.
prior to this communication course, I was like, I'm a pretty good communicator. Like, how hard can it be? I communicate all the time. And then like week one, taking ownership. Okay, I'm going to be really reflective about this. And then week two, you know, here are some common ways that things break down. Like, oh, I see that. I see that. I see that.
On that point, do you mind taking a stab at we got a shared document here that we're kind of looking at. There's those 3 main points. If you don't want to do it, I can do it, but I want to give you the opportunity to kind of run through those 3, just to be able to know about what the main points are that we have with miscommunication or breakdowns.
Yeah, so the 3 points that we discussed in this class is like common ways for communication to break down is if communication is undelivered, is incomplete, or is misunderstood. So maybe we can talk about each one of those independently about what, so I can actually pull out my notes from the class too to kind of tell you what my takeaways were, but like undelivered communication, like what came to mind for me was if there's like an uncomfortable topic that I don't really want to talk about, but like maybe it needs to be talked about.
Yeah, like a fear of actually approaching something, and by dwelling on it, you kind of decide to like just let that one go and hope that it turns out all right.
Yeah, like, you know, thoughtful criticism is still criticism. Like it's uncomfortable. So I know that I personally will, like, I have to really get on myself if there's something that needs to be said to somebody, like, hey, I need you to change X, Y, and Z. Like I have to do a whole mental preparation thing to get myself to like say these things.
And I was listening to a podcast that was discussing this, and while I talk, I'll try and pull it up so I can see what she called it. But she was speaking about how there is like a method of being conscious of what your feedback is. So obviously soliciting feedback is a really good thing. Otherwise you're not growing. And from our last session, we learned that like if you're going to be in a ownership mindset, you will have to be growing at all times. You're never stagnant. You're not going to stop growing. But to do that, you really need to solicit feedback. And some people don't take that so well. I can't think of what her thing was without going into it, but she was basically saying like being, it was using the word like candor, like thoughtful candor, maybe is how she described it, where you think about the other person, how do you provide feedback, but make it in such a way that fits with their personalities and their temperaments, that you don't upset them, and also make it so that they can learn from it in a safe environment, which was interesting to hear. The other one,
that makes me think a little bit of, have you ever read the book Insight?
I took one of the Insights quizzes back at an old company.
I think the author's name is like Tasha Urich or something like that.
That sounds familiar.
But anyway, that what you're just describing strongly reminds me of this book Insight, which is about how do you solicit feedback, like candid, honest feedback from other people, and in terms of how are you perceived by other people.
Interesting. Does it get super specific, like you're a so-and-so person with traits of blah 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 and a little bit of this?
No, not at all. It's more like here are some practical ways you can approach your, let's say, your boss to get their honest feedback about your performance.
Okay.
Because if you just go to your boss and say, hey, I want feedback about my performance, that's kind of because of this whole undelivered communication thing, it's an uncomfortable thing to put an uncomfortable position to put somebody in.
Right.
So she talks about how you can frame it in different ways to get like actually useful feedback.
Oh, cool. Okay.
And she also talks about like something that's really important, I think, to me, and probably to a lot of people, is understanding whose insights are important and whose are not. So, for example, it matters to me a lot what my partner thinks about me, like how he perceives me. But at the same time, you know, if one of my coworkers has a negative opinion of me, like maybe that matters and maybe it doesn't.
Yeah, it depends on what the opinion is, maybe.
Depends on the opinion, depends how it affects your ability to work together. And she goes into like, when you're like, if I'm looking for insight about how people perceive me, I probably am not going to go to that coworker.
Right.
Like, I'm going to go to people who are going to be
positive,
but also maybe not. Maybe there's something about my personality that's not so positive, but I need somebody who's going to come at me with caring vibes, caring and loving vibes,
right,
to tell me that negative thing so that I can receive it, compared to somebody who's just coming at me with negative energy.
Yeah, that's a good point. I remember I was working an internship a long time ago, so I was still young, and I'd gone through this whole internship, and at the end of it, it was me and a few other people that had done it, and we asked for feedback. And the whole time we'd been working this internship, it was no issue, but come feedback, it was like, bam, bam, it's like lambasted us. We were like, it was really a dip in cold water. It was shocking. And it was not the way to maybe do it, because we dwelled on it. All of us talked about it after. Like, we dwelled on that for a long time. It's like, man, I didn't know that I acted that way, and that it came across in that fashion. And we're young, and we were very inexperienced at that point with like how we are perceived or what the thought is about our work or whatever. So yeah, it was not the best way to do that. So to your point, that's very important. And a lot of managers and upper level people may not have that necessarily if it's all performance based.
Yeah, I recommend the book. It's one of those books that I read really quickly and then realized it was like content dense. So like I went back and read it slowly.
Okay. I've got it pulled up here on a browser so I can look at it later.
Is it Tasha Eurich? I feel like it is.
Tasha Eurich, yep. Dang. It's pretty good. The other topic with this was like fear was one for like undelivered messages. Often we're like, we don't want to approach something, or we don't want to talk or think about it. The other one was bad timing was issued out. It could be that you got distracted and you didn't send an email, or you got busy and it became less of a priority on your to-do list to go talk to X person about this one issue. And it kind of keeps lagging behind until the point where you're like, well, I might as well not talk about it anymore.
Yeah, there are lots of ways that can be undelivered. Just anytime you don't communicate, communication can't happen. It's kind of basic.
Yeah. What about the other two?
So the next one is incomplete communication.
Okay.
And actually, I'm going to pull out my notes real quick, because somebody said something really profound during the session. Well, to me, profound. Maybe it's not so profound.
I'm curious if it's the one that I wrote down too. There was one that I wrote down when Mike was talking that was about speaking up during like a meeting, like staying quiet. It's like someone was saying in the group that they feel uncomfortable speaking up during a meeting for sounding like they're wrong or it might not happen right.
Yeah.
And he said that the cost of, because they were worried about being perfect. Obviously, you want to be right and you want to say the right thing during a meeting, but the cost of perfect is speaking up, was the comment. And I was like, that's a good point, that you're not going to get feedback, or you're not going to learn or get out there unless you do speak up and make some mistakes and actually feel comfortable making mistakes. Like, we're human. It's okay. We don't have to have the right solution every time.
Yeah, when we were talking about that fear of like not being perfect, that also resonated with me, because again, these exercises, these sessions are making me be more self-reflective and realizing how imperfect my communication is. And my instinct is to just stop communicating until it's perfect, but that's not how you get better.
Right. It's not at all.
So like that whole conversation, we were talking about how you can't be perfect. You just have to do it. You just have to speak up, even if it's not perfect. You have to speak up even though it's going to be imperfect.
A funny thing that I want to share with that is, well, for one, we're all designers, and I feel like designers in a room with other designers often are a bit insecure about not knowing something. Like, it's our job in some ways is to be confident in public about knowledge, and we have a plan and we know what's going on, everything's under control. And I mean, as a rep for different products, I might approach a group of people and say, all right, guys, we're going to talk about this today. Has anyone ever, does anyone here in the room not know about X, Y, or Z? And you get a sea of flat faces and no hands. And then I'll say one thing, I'll say, it's okay if you don't. Like, that's what we're here to do, is learn. And then everyone looks around, they're like, it's fine, it's okay. You don't need to know everything. That's what we're here to talk about. But that one qualifying statement changed people's perspectives so dramatically. Just to say, like, it's okay if you don't know what this is. Don't feel embarrassed. That it changed the mood of how people would interact in that meeting. Yeah,
and thinking about, like, people who I admire that I've worked with, they're really good at that, at soliciting some information from folks, and then when nobody wants to answer because it's scary to answer, they're really good at saying, it's okay if you don't know, just communicate that much to me. Yeah, like, are you alive in there? Hello. Yeah. I don't remember what book this is from. It was, so the man who wrote it, he owns a construction company somewhere, but he's blind, and it's a book about communication, and he was talking about how he would hold like staff meetings, and he would ask a question and people would like nod their head or shake their head, but he's blind, so he's like, I need verbal answers from every single one of you. And that kind of stuck with me. Like, how often would it be actually beneficial to require people to verbally give their input? With like a verbal yes or no, or even a I feel like that's very non-committal. I would prefer a yes or a no. It's like a thoughtful yes. That feels too non-committal to me. You do it your way, I'll do it mine. I wish I remember the name of that book. I don't remember it right now. But it was a book about communication, and it was, again, somebody who's in the construction industry, and it was interesting. That particular part of the book stuck with me. Which, getting back to the incomplete communication, that's another example of incomplete communication, when the person who's receiving the information either isn't in a place where they can receive the information, or the information that you're giving is not the full picture, like you're in committal. I would argue is incomplete communication. Oh.
That's like the therapist response. When they're like, yeah, I have all these problems. They're like, And you're like, what are you thinking about me? I'm not crazy, am I?
We're not going to go there.
We're all a little bit of crazy.
A little bit. We're all on the spectrum.
With incomplete, we've gotten kind of the lost in translation talked about a bit, where the actual response is not affirmative, or you take it as being affirmative. The lack of follow through was the other one that I thought was interesting.
Yeah.
Because I'm guilty of that, because I want people to do their, like, if you say you're going to do something, I hope that it happens. And then when it doesn't happen, I'm like, okay, well, I should have probably done more.
Yeah, the hard thing with follow through, at least for me, is you never realize it's missing until it's missing. Like, because you don't want to be that person that's like hounding somebody. Like, hey, have you done this yet? Have you done this yet? Have you done this yet? But like, if it's the kind of task that somebody does need to be reminded, like I need to be reminded all the time about certain tasks. Like, I appreciate somebody coming to me like, hey, have you done this yet?
Yeah. A little poke.
Yeah, like, oh yeah, that's supposed to be on my list and it's not on my list, but let me fix that for you.
Bad timing came up and you didn't put, that's why it was undelivered, you didn't put it on your list because it like someone else, like the dog came by and you're like, oh, cute dog.
Yeah. So yeah, and also incomplete, like, so another example I was thinking of with incomplete during the session was like I remember when I was younger, the bosses would say, I need you to detail X, Y, and Z. And I'd be like, okay, like in theory, I know how to detail X, Y, and Z. And then I would do it, and then I would take it back to them for review, and they're like, oh, no, you could never construct this. And it's like, all right, well, clearly I didn't have enough information. You know, like when there's, I feel like incomplete communication in my world happens a lot when there's just like the assumption that the other party knows all the details.
Yeah, and that actually couples in with the next one too.
It does.
Which is misunderstanding what other people's communications are, or misunderstanding how you are communicating with someone else, which is probably that to me is the biggest of the three that I interact with on a regular basis, is just completely revolving around misunderstandings. Or and I try more and more to remind myself that it's up to me as the communicator to own that, and not to be place the blame game on someone else. I'm like, why didn't they understand that? That's so simple. Because that's not helping. It's on me to figure out whether or
ownership.
Ownership. You gotta own it. You gotta own it. Are you accountable? I don't know. I'm misunderstanding.
Yeah, misunderstanding I think is also really hard, particularly like now when so much communication is virtual.
Or email.
Yeah, email is so hard.
It's like, do you write an essay, or do you just have to make some assumptions, or would it be better just to have a phone call? But phone calls are,
and the other thing too, like, so this before this recording, we were talking about like the challenges of being a woman in design. Yeah. And emails are a big thing, because I remember being told, like, as a woman, like my natural style of communication is very direct. Like, hi, this is what I need.
Right.
And I remember being told as a younger designer that I was coming off as a little brash. And so I needed to like soften my emails a little bit. So now I'll say like, hi, how are you doing? You know, good to see you last week at the such and such and such. So anyway, I wanted X, Y, and Z from you.
Where is it?
Yeah. And it's something, you know, somebody told me, so I try to do it in my emails. But I don't know how relevant it is or isn't in today's day and age.
I would say it is a relevant topic. And the reason I say it is I just read a book called Machiavelli for Women, talking about, it was very good. Here is, I don't know if that's actually coming through or not.
I can see it. Yeah.
Very good book. I really enjoyed it because it was coming from the perspective, obviously, of how do you work as a woman in an environment that is dominated by a power leadership that's mainly percentage-wise owned by men, and typically men that are white. And it also applied to minorities or anyone that was not in the central dogma of ownership or power or influence in companies and advancing through careers. And I found it really intriguing and interesting to hear, because that exact topic came up of like people were being told feedback, women were being told feedback of the mindset, the stereotypical mindset of how a woman should be. And it was interacting with the actual interactions of the people in leadership. They're like, man, she sounds really crass and direct, and that's okay for men to sound like that, but for a woman, it's not so okay. And I was like, that's really fascinating to hear that that's a thing, and how in this book she kind of talked about getting around that, or understanding at least the game that is. It was really interesting.
Yeah, I don't know. There's part of me that thinks there's So there's part of me that thinks there's value in the feminine email where you say, how are you doing? Like putting the person first. I think I do think there's value in that exercise. And especially again, for me, since my natural tendency is to be so work focused, to like remember to take time to appreciate that the person who's receiving this email is a person with a life. Like, I think there's a lot of value to that. So part of me kind of thinks that we should be telling all people, men and women, to soften their emails. That maybe the feminine way is just a slightly better way to communicate.
Or the complete opposite. If everyone was more just direct, like it's an email, it's not like we're composing a letter to someone. It's usually, it's the idea of an email is also changed to being like active ping pong, basically a text. It's like, do you need that? I don't know. I mean, I remember seeing a director at some point spend a lot of time writing emails that were multi-paragraph and very thoughtful and very well written. But at the end of the day, the person who received it wasn't reading it, and they weren't getting the message. And it was all for naught. He'd come back and say something in response to that was already addressed in the email. And you're like, well, do I just point out that it's already there, or do I try and further clarify?
Maybe there's a balance. Like start off saying, hey, how are you doing? And then be very direct.
Down to business. Let's get down to brass tacks.
Yeah. Because you're right, like a lengthy, flowery email is just not going to get read in today's day and age. Like it's not like writing a letter. Email is not the equivalent of writing a letter.
Right. And like, so my wife is from Europe, and she found so strange that we would, as a greeting, say, how are you, or how are you doing? And she's like, but no one really wants to know. I'm like, I don't know. Some people do.
I feel like I'm generally curious, but if you don't want to answer, that's also okay.
True. That's fair. Would you say that what I just described was like the wrong method as a misunderstood topic? There's like assumption gaps in what you are saying, what you think you're saying, and what the other person's hearing, or maybe the wrong method of delivering that message. Like the email can be construed as being this thing where it's not.
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of alluded to this earlier, that, you know, sometimes what you need to communicate can be communicated in an email, but sometimes you need to pick up the phone. And like, there's like that very stereotypical, this meeting could have been an email.
Yes. like the complete opposite of the spectrum.
Yeah, like, did we really need to have a meeting to hear this information that could have just been a really quick email?
Right. And that goes to ownership too. Like we covered kind of a recap of last week's at the beginning of this week's session. And one of the things that I see the most often, and maybe you do too, but it's meetings, poorly run meetings where you do not have a clear objective of what you want to accomplish from the meeting. What is your presence in the meeting needed for, and following through with the actual action items from a meeting, like a method, saying at the end of it, like, guys, we're going to do this. We're all in agreement, right? Everyone good? Okay. So you're going to have this, you're going to have this, you're going to have this.
And you get your verbal yeses.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. You hear a lot of that. And then like a month later, when you come back, you're like, where's everybody on this? They're like, oh, they're like, do I make something up on the spot? Or I just didn't do it.
Yeah, I think it depends on what kind of task you're talking about. Because like, so for example, right now, my office is closed. So we have a lot of virtual meetings.
Right.
Because it's the only way to communicate. And it's, in my opinion, really effective, even though not every meeting does have an agenda.
Right.
Just as long as you kind of upfront know what you're supposed to be talking about. I have had a couple meetings that it's just somebody that I enjoy talking to, and so we'll chit chat for 5 or 10 minutes and then get off the phone. But for the most part, they're pretty effective. They're basically a phone call, but you get facial expressions.
Speaking of, like, do you take phone calls typically, or are they usually not seen or perceived as a nuisance? Whereas like you'd rather just have email in your own personal viewpoint? Because I know it changes from person to person. Some people hate phone calls.
I don't mind phone calls. My problem with professional phone calls right now is our firm switched to Zoom as our phone carrier.
Oh, I didn't even know they had it.
It's a thing. And it's on the whole very nice, but I haven't yet figured out how to get it to forward to my phone.
Oh, like the voice.
So my computer will light up and say, hey, you're getting a phone call, but I can't answer it because I don't know how.
Have you communicated that problem to someone in the department?
I honestly have not. This is definitely an instance of undelivered communication.
Yeah.
It's only come up like once a month. I don't get very many phone calls. I get a lot of emails. I get a lot of Zoom calls. But like people don't generally call me.
Okay.
Like on the phone. If they're talking to me, they're generally on Zoom or Teams. So that's my current struggle with phone calls. As I don't know how to answer them.
I do wish people would take more phone calls though. Like from a coordination standpoint, I'll be honest. A lot of people may disagree, but I really feel like you can accomplish so much more effectively with like a 5-minute phone call to talk about something versus typing out an email, rereading the email, trying to see if what the perspective is from the other person.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of it is if, ands, or buts. So it's not really something you can piecemeal put together all these different scenarios. Like, well, if this happens, then here's my thoughts. If this happens, here's my thoughts. It's way easier just to get that over the phone. And then if you need to, for the sake of ownership, write notes and send it in an email after. Or we're at the point now with like voice transcribing, you can take notes with your phone while you're talking on it.
Yeah, I think for me, Zoom ends up being a more valuable tool than a phone call because you can share your screen.
Mm-hmm. That too.
So it's basically a phone call, but you can look at the same thing.
Yep.
And for me, that saved a lot of time, like not doing emails. Like coordination with consultants, you can just jump on a Zoom call, share your screen, circle what you're talking about, mark up a page,
Yep.
Which is kind of like a phone call. I mean, there's certain information where you don't need the visual, and then a phone call is totally appropriate.
Right.
And like I still not, now that I'm thinking about it more, I like our consultants on our projects have my personal phone number, so they just call me directly. So I do still get phone calls for certain things.
Right. Are you at that point where you put your in like your signature, you'll even put your like cell phone?
No, it's privileged information.
Privileged information. Okay. Because I was like, a lot, I'm seeing that more and more and more, that people actually put their cell phone numbers in their signature. And I've certainly seen it from both ways. I've had people call my office number and I'm like, I'm not there. I'm like, just call my cell phone. So I put my cell phone on the signature. I prefer them to call that. It's never been abused, but I'm sure if it got abused by someone, I would probably start changing. Okay, this needs to.
I used to work for a firm in Seattle, but I lived in Virginia, so the time difference, it's 3 hours time difference, and their phone system was set up. If you called I had a local Seattle phone number, and if you called that number, it forwarded to my phone.
Okay.
But I had to set up my phone to block those phone calls like after a certain time, because the office didn't close until 8 or 9 p.m.
Oh.
Like my time.
Oh, gotcha.
So I'd have colleagues trying to call me at like 8 o'clock at night, and I'm just like, I don't work at 8 o'clock at night.
Yeah.
Like
call me at 7 a.m. your time.
Yeah, or call me at noon my time.
Yep.
Like, which is 9 o'clock their time. Like you have the whole bulk of your day, like a good 6 hours before I'm like definitely not answering my phone.
I hate that though, when I'll be wrapping up the last thing on my list, like 4:30 or 5, and there's like one thing that I need to get a quick answer on, but I'm always realizing like, shoot, it's 4:30 or 5, and I call the person, like, please call me back, please. I'll be all done with my list. I'll only take a minute. I swear.
You gotta plan ahead. It's communication. That's what's that one? Undelivered communication because of bad timing.
Mm-hmm. And it waits the whole weekend or whatever, and you're like, well, I guess it wasn't that important, was it? Or was it? The other thing I wanted to talk about, because this is such a to me, this is like the ultimate in miscommunication, and it's, I think, probably going to be a thread throughout the whole series, is our profession being called landscape architects. I think that is the beginning of a misunderstanding for what people see us as a profession. Like, I don't have a good answer for what it should be called, but I do think
this is fascinating. So, okay. So I'm teaching an Introduction to Landscape Architecture course at Ball State University. Mm-hmm. And our first week of the course is like, what is landscape architecture? And there's numerous literature that says landscape architecture is the wrong way to call it, but nobody has a better way to call it.
You want to hear my fun theory?
What's your fun theory?
I like the idea of taking both landscape and architecture out of it completely. Mm-hmm. So I'll explain after, but I think it'd be fun to call it like a what is the word I had? A site arbiter. Because it's like someone who judges over the whole purview, but it's not specific, but the word site's in there. But I don't feel like site relates to anything yet in another profession. Like, and the reason I said this is like, I see two different responses from most people that don't know what a landscape architect is. And they hook on one of those two words. Either they're like, oh, you're an architect. And they're like, here's my architect friend. And I'm like, I'm not an architect. Like, it's very different from what I do and not at all related. Or they hook on the landscape part. Like, oh, you do landscapes and yards and stuff. Like, you can come do my yard. Everyone's heard this. But I think those two words are a problem that I have. The biggest problem I have is misunderstanding or assuming And I think that people try and latch on, if they don't understand something, they try to latch on like a lifeboat to something they can comprehend, versus like, no, we don't want to hear that you dabble in environmental issues or water quality or plants and horticulture or urban planning or structural. Like, they don't want to hear that. Like, it's too much. It's like our profession does a little bit of all these things, and it's hard to pin it down. So you almost need like a nebulous type name, I think.
But like I said, we spend an entire week of this course talking about what is landscape architecture because it's so nebulous.
Right.
Like, it's the term landscape architecture, I would argue, does kind of describe what we're doing. Like, architecture is design, we're designing the landscape. Like, sure, maybe site architecture is the way to go. I don't know. But yeah, just the fact that it takes a whole week of class to get people who are not familiar with landscape, because again, it's introduction to landscape architecture. So it's students who've by and large never heard of landscape architecture, and trying to get them to understand what we're going to be talking about for the whole semester.
Was Olmsted actually the one who coined that term? Like, I don't even
Olmsted was the one who coined the term.
Okay. Olmsted.
I know. What are we gonna do with him? Can't live with him, can't live without him.
Yeah, I mean, they didn't really have like mow and blow guys from True Green coming through. I don't know. Like, it wasn't a thing to have like just I guess maybe the image of a landscape designer wasn't a thing versus a landscape architect in terms of health, safety, and welfare, and what that means and the implications of that. Because in China, I worked at Turnscape for a couple of years, and while I was over there, I kind of learned like about their background culturally with landscape architecture. And I got to work with like Dr. Yu Kong Jin, who was basically the Olmsted in that area. Like, it wasn't a thing as a profession until probably the past 20 or 30 years that it became a thing. And it was really just more garden design before. It was not a disrespectful in any way, but it was just very intentional about gardens, like traditional Chinese gardens, of how they were laid out and oriented. But it wasn't the same as landscape architecture, where you're taking this big picture view and you're trying to incorporate all these different systems together, and people and ecosystems and animals and plants and blah, blah, blah. So like it does become this big nebulous idea. But yeah, I don't know that there is a better word or not, but I just feel like the miscommunication comes from the word, in a way, that people latch on to one or the other as their initial response.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, except that I don't think that there's a better way to describe it.
Yeah.
And
the arbiter is a cool word, though.
I mean, fair. But it's just such a big profession with so many different career paths that it's really hard. I mean, it's just really hard to understand what it is.
And that's why we've never
we're going to spend an entire semester talking about what it is.
Yeah. And that's why it's never changed. I definitely have been around, and I don't know that it should change, honestly. It's just, there isn't, in my mind, a much better word, except the only thing I'm talking about is more just having an issue with people, knowing that people will latch on to an assumption. The name doesn't help us, I don't think, in that sense. But you're right. Like,
well, I mean, like, consider the word architect. Like the word architect, right? It has a specific meaning. Somebody who designs buildings. But it's been co-opted in different ways. So there's like a systems architect or software architect, and
exactly.
I totally lost
different than like a
thought.
systems engineer, which I don't know how that is.
Yeah, are they engineers? I don't know, maybe.
And maybe the architect has more like of a systems architect. They might have more interaction with like the user interface and how it looks and how it's the perception of it versus just the nuts and bolts of numbers and how it's put together. Anyone, since we're going to be posting this on YouTube, since anyone wants to post in the chat, we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, if you have a better way to describe us, let's hear it.
Like and just, by the way, like and subscribe and smash that bell and all that.
Oh, ew.
No? Okay. All right.
I mean, yes, do those things, but ew.
Come on, Jessie, get with the whole like hype.
I'm just not a YouTube star.
But we're on the hype train now. Like we're doing the YouTube star. We're YouTubers.
Okay.
Okay.
Good. I hope it's successful.
I don't think we misunderstood each other there at all. We're had a breakdown in communication. All right. Any closing topics or thoughts from you?
Well, one thing we didn't talk about that I have in my notes is like we talked about the consequences of ineffective communication and the opportunities of effective communication. And
whether or not you get the like button or the dislike button on YouTube.
Yeah, so for example, opportunities of effective communication, clicking on the like button or whatever the YouTube has, like that would be effective communication. And the opportunity is you could continue to get content like this delivered to you.
See, that's the problem, is we're going to keep making it regardless.
Yeah, it's just going to keep happening. Just keep happening.
But no, you're right. The consequences of inaction as well, or not communicating or miscommunicating, there is a bit of taking ownership of that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like the thing I wrote down was that you don't achieve the right goal.
Mm-hmm.
So like you might be communicating enough to achieve a goal,
right?
But maybe it's not the one you were trying to go for. So
do you have any specific examples in like your life or experience professionally that have been that way, where it might have, or maybe it's like the example you gave up before where you were asked to create a detail, but it was not specific. So you created a detail that you thought was achieving that goal, and then it was completely off from what the director or
not constructible.
Not constructible, even.
Not with the knowledge I have today, I can tell you, not constructible.
What was it, by the way? Can I ask?
It was so it's going to be hard to describe. We were doing custom art lights, not bollards really, more lights.
Okay.
And we were trying to figure out how to make them work.
Okay.
They are currently constructed and they're beautiful. They're in Bothell, Washington, around the library.
Okay.
If you happen to be in the area, you should check them out. They're beautiful.
I do work with lighting.
Yeah, so we did these custom lights it's a group of 3 lights at different heights. And then we did custom laser cut metal powder coated images. We did like local, I think like sandhill cranes and salmon, and I don't even remember what else. But bubbles were a big part of it. Lots of bubbles because it was along the project was daylighting a creek.
Okay.
So they daylit a creek, and then they wanted to have a bunch of public functional art.
Okay.
That celebrated that creek. So
I gotcha.
Yeah.
So you were basically taking like a frosted lens type lighted bollard and then adding like a mesh stencil on the outside to create the patterns and shapes.
What we ended up doing, so we ended up having the panels laser cut and then bolted together, and then doing a frosted plexiglass behind the panel.
Okay.
And then there was an interior core, and we wrapped, maybe it was just like rope light, even something simple. We just wrapped around the middle.
That's pretty cool.
So it's like a lit beacon.
I'd love to have a series like later on down the road that talks about like, it revisits maybe some of these things that we've done in our professional lives, like the design, see like how do they hold up, like has it now?
Yeah, like a lessons learned sort of thing.
we don't do that near enough. We're like, man, this thing looks great. Moving on to the next thing.
Yeah. I have a couple projects that, like, in retrospect, like, yeah, I would have done them differently.
You're right. You're not alone.
That could easily be a whole series.
That could easily be, or maybe like a reoccurring segment, like every once a month. Like
How
lessons
to do it better next time. If you're ever doing this, try this instead.
or call it like A for effort.
Like E for effort.
E for effort. It's off the charts, Jessie.
It's like elementary school grading. It's better.
Okay, I think we are probably at time.
Yeah.
You got anything else before I close this out?
No, I think this has been a very interesting conversation. I hope other folks enjoy it too.
Well, good. Thank you. I appreciate you coming on too, and taking some time out for this, because I think it's neat to get different people's perspectives from the group. We're going to still continue to try and get different folks from the program to come through for these next, I guess, 10 sessions after this. And I'm glad that you're a part of it and hopefully learning a lot. I'm very happy to be learning a lot right next to you. So thank you, Jessie, for coming on.
Thank you.
And we will see everybody in the next episode 3 next week. All right. Bye, guys.